It's been an interesting week coming out of the White House, or actually a couple of weeks coming out of the White House, Tom.
Has Joe Biden gotten funny?
Depends on how you define funny. There's been some interesting comments coming from his mouth. And I don't know if he's getting away from his handlers or what's happening. 2 weeks ago, when he announced his new push for tighter gun control restrictions, Joe Biden decides to announce on national television from the Rose Garden that the amendments to the Constitution are not absolute.
Hey, man, that could be great news, Dave, because one of those amendments calls for an income tax.
I was thinking I don't have to pay it anymore.
Yeah,
is that the case?
The president just said they're not absolute.
Will they refund the money I already paid?
How about that? You know, in a way, Joe Biden is, of course, now he's not talking about the income tax from his point of view. Oh, that is absolute. That is sacred. You not only have to pay in all your income tax, you should probably be paying more because it's not really your fair share. What he means are things like protections for speech and religious liberty and owning and carrying a gun and things like that. That's what when he says they're not absolute. And in a way, he is the problem that the founders warned us against.
Sure.
One of my favorite arguments to point to comes in the Federalist Papers, number 84. The authors of the Federalists, including the two primary architects of the Constitution, James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, they come out fully opposed to a Bill of Rights. And their main reason is they say, once you start to list rights, name any right to free speech, right to own a gun, you name it, you are inviting the political class, lawmakers, judges, bureaucrats, to start defining what your rights mean. Right. And as they define them, they're going to restrict them. Case in point. The right to bear arms shall not be infringed. Well, that's not absolute. We need judges to decide what kind of guns is included in the word arms, right? And when
are
and where,
arms even guns? Are they just are they clubs? Are they? I mean, you never know, right?
Yes.
It's all kinds of weapons that they can start defining. So we went through that whole thing, and the domino effect of that is just unconscionable. Before you know it, you're going to start getting knocks on your door from somebody from the military saying, "Hey, I need your spare bedroom for the night."
Let me just finish that thought because I don't want to leave our listeners hanging there on a cliff. They're probably thinking, "Wait, Krenwitter just said it's bad to list rights. What do we do? How do we protect liberty?" The answer is get away from defining, defending, talking about your rights. Focus all your attention on the few powers that we, the people, have granted to our government. We granted in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, there's the list of the few powers we, the people, vested in our Congress.
Right.
We vested no power, none, to regulate our speech, to regulate our newspapers, to regulate our religious worship, our religious liberty, to regulate our weapons of any kind. We granted them no power at all. That's how to think like a constitutionalist.
And let's be clear, we're not advocating today to go abolish the Bill of Rights.
No.
We're just suggesting that you don't need the Bill of Rights to claim your rights. Your rights were there already. Madison and Hamilton especially, saw the Bill of Rights as redundant. They were already there. You already had them. And to stop going into courthouses and saying, please, it says in the Bill of Rights I have this right. No, you had that right without it.
Rather, go into courthouses and go to the court of public opinion and point out, we the people never gave Congress this power to do the thing that they just did. They just did something for which they have no constitutional authority to do. That's why it's unconstitutional. Should be repealed, abolished, struck down, declared null and void.
So then fast forward a few days, and Joe Biden finally, we think, okay, they're finally gonna acknowledge that there is a crisis at the border.
Yeah.
Right? That we have thousands of migrants flooding from Central America through Mexico, coming to the border, overwhelming CPB.
Well, Dave, the good news is the president did acknowledge. I believe he even used the word crisis, did he? Now, he said there is a crisis at the border.
Right. So now here's the question. according to White House officials, I'm going to read this. I actually have it up on my phone. This is a CNN article, by the way. This is not Fox News. This is not Breitbart. This is not InfoWars. I'm not pushing out some right-wing website or anything else.
CNN.
This is CNN. It starts, the White House on Monday backtracked after President Joe Biden over the weekend described the influx of migrant children on the country's southern border as a crisis in what appeared to be a notable shift in language. Now from CNN, quote, the president's use of the crisis label doesn't represent the administration's official position, the White House said on Monday, in regard to a term that top administration officials have refused to say as the number of migrants surged.
There you go.
So what I just read from CNN, they're telling me that Joe Biden's actual words don't represent the voice of the White House.
Right, not the policy of the White House. Well, imagine, I love the power of imagination. I think conservatives and constitutionalists talk too little about imagination. Imagination is the gateway, the doorway, the path to a better future, right? Because we imagine things that we want to improve and how things could be better. Imagine an Abraham Lincoln signing the Emancipation Proclamation and then some bozo coming out and say, well, any statement written or uttered by the president isn't actually the policy of the White House.
It's just unfathomable to me. If you can't trust the president's words, who is running the White House? And who is getting on stage and actually sitting there and saying, who is calling CNN and saying, oh, don't worry about what Joe Biden said.
Right.
You talk about not knowing who our elected officials are.
He's merely the president.
Right.
You can't expect the president to speak for the White House. In a way, this is good. This is progressivism 101.
Right.
You can't have elected clowns like the president setting official policy for the White House. You need the unelected bureaucrats setting that policy.
Fair. And that's what we would have gotten from like the 1930s on.
Yeah.
But what would Woodrow Wilson have said to Joe Biden right now? Woodrow Wilson, who says the president has to be the most powerful person in the country.
Yeah.
The entire government apparatus has to work to help the president guide the ship and take it.
The president is the Fuhrer.
Right.
He's the leader.
He's the leader.
Yeah.
Well, somebody is out there saying, no, he's just some guy. He's old. He's a little off his rocker, and he didn't mean that word. He didn't mean to say it. He was referring to something else.
Well, if the president's not in charge of the White House, if his statements don't represent the official policy, if it's some unelected employee, bureaucrat, someone else, it raises the whole question, how are citizens supposed to know what is the policy of our own government? Which, of course, points to the bigger question. What is the government supposed to even be doing? What is the White House supposed to be doing? What's any branch of the federal government supposed to be doing? What is the purpose of government? And that big question, what's the purpose of government, in a way is on everybody's mind right now because we're in the midst of a big trial.
Right.
Up in Minnesota, Derek Chauvin, the cop accused of killing, murdering. Is murder one of the charges?
It's
manslaughter.
Manslaughter.
Yeah.
Second degree murder.
Murder.
They did second degree murder, third degree murder, and
Manslaughter.
and second degree manslaughter.
Okay.
Because first degree I think requires proof of intent, and second degree even does to a certain extent as well. And we should point out, I think most of our listeners know at this point, but we do record these a little bit in advance. The jury currently, at the time of us recording this,
they're deliberating.
Mm-hmm. There's a high likelihood that by the time this podcast comes out, they will have made a decision. But we thought it was too important to not even talk about.
Well, and because it raises the whole question here. I mean, when things like this happen, I think the natural reaction of many Americans is to focus on the individual, the person, the personality, how that person is portrayed, whether they like the person or don't. There's many millions of Americans right now are thinking, I don't like this Derek Chauvin guy. He looked arrogant. He did look arrogant as he was, kneeling on the neck of George Floyd and all of that terribleness. But we tend to forget or brush it aside, or we just don't talk about the fact this is a government agent This is a representative of legalized government power, which brings the whole question: what is government supposed to be doing? Are cops supposed to be out knocking people down and kneeling on their necks and possibly killing them or not? What's the purpose of government, and how do we think about this whole subject of cops and guns? Because in a way, that's what this is all about.
Right. And so it's interesting that we had that comment from Joe Biden, and we have this huge push right now for strict gun control.
Yeah.
And before I talk about the dichotomy there, I want our listeners to remember the point of the Second Amendment, the point of talking and calling out gun rights specifically, right to bear arms specifically, was not just I hate the hunting argument, right? When people go out and say, oh, well, I need an AR-15 for hunting. I don't care if you want or need an AR-15 for hunting or not. That has absolutely nothing to do with the point of the right. The point of the right is to defend yourself, both from individuals trying to harm you when you have no other option, and from the legal use of force that the government possesses when the government is using it unjustly.
That's right.
So
tyranny.
What's that?
Tyranny.
Tyranny,
protecting yourself from the problem of tyranny.
So on the one hand, we have Joe Biden talking about restricting gun rights.
Yep.
And on the other hand, we have a whole trial going on about a cop who, listen, there's a lot to unwind about the Derek Chauvin trial and what he should be convicted for, if he should be, and what his charges should be for. Yeah. But at the end of the day, he wasn't a good cop. He had over a dozen citations for excessive force, for abuse of suspects, for harming people, and we need the ability to defend ourselves from that.
Yeah, I mean, let's dig in. I want to come back to this subject of how we have created modern police forces and the kinds of protections and incentives and powers we have vested in them, and how that lends itself to abuse. But let's start by kind of putting on the table here the progressive position today, like so many progressive positions, is filled with it. There's a contradiction right at the heart of it. On the one hand, progressives insist we need stricter control over what kinds of guns and other weapons citizens may have, how they may use them, where they may or may not carry them. More control, less freedom, less choice in all those realms. That is a core plank of the progressive position today. At the same time, those same progressives reassure us you don't need guns, really, to be safe because the police will keep us safe. That's why we have professionally and the police, they are trained. They know how to handle firearms and other kinds of weapons. They're certified. They go through all this training that ordinary citizens don't, and they're there to protect us. So we don't need guns. We citizens don't need guns, and we're likely to hurt ourselves or hurt others if we do have them. That's one position within the progressive movement today. And the good news is we can rely on cops to protect us. They're part of the government, and they're trained how to use guns. Now, where are the problems? Where's the contradiction here? The contradiction is, what is the trial that, everyone's expecting some kind of terrible violence. I saw the governor of Minnesota has declared a state of emergency ahead of time. I mean, the trial's not even over yet.
Well, but there already has been a lot of violence in Minnesota. We had the Duante or Dante. I forgot his last name, but we had that whole situation.
The police officer who thought she was grabbing her taser. This is a well-trained police officer. This is exactly the kind of government employee that progressives tell us, leave your safety in their hands.
Right.
They are competent, trained. You don't need a gun, Dave, because that police officer in Minnesota, she has a gun and she's going to protect you unless she confuses it for a taser and shoots you and kills you. And so here's the problem. There are moments when progressives assure us the police are here to protect you. Don't worry about your safety. They're going to keep you safe. And at the same time, progressives say, we got to defund the police because they're a bunch of violent, murderous, racist. We can't trust them. They will kill us. We got to get rid of them. By the way, this last week I spent some time with a gentleman I became friends with maybe 10 years ago. Spent some time with him in Washington, D.C., Robert Woodson, who's done some really interesting work. He's now in his mid-80s, and he was part of the civil rights movement back in the 1960s, marched with Martin Luther King, has been in the toughest of tough neighborhoods his entire adult life, and trying to help poor people, poor black people, but also poor people, period, become creative, productive, enjoy some upward economic mobility in their lives. And he was pointing out that up to 85% of black people in the United States today do not want to defund the police. Think about that. All these calls by progressives to defund the police, you know who's not calling for that? Black Americans who live in poor neighborhoods. Right. Because they know things are tough in their neighborhoods already. You defund the police, it's going to get a whole lot tougher. Talk about an example of white privilege, right? These are white progressives living in posh little suburban neighborhoods. They're the ones calling for the defunding of the police,
like Nancy Pelosi and Maxine Waters. These are the progressive elite, right? It's the elites living in these, and they've got big fences. They've got big walls built around their houses.
Probably
in
some
California.
Private security as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. So this whole subject here is filled with contradictions and confusions, and whatever we think about the police, look, I'm going to be honest here. I'm one of these people. I never say I always stand with the police no matter what. There are some cops who do some bad things. This kind of brings us back to the subject I just mentioned a few minutes ago. When you look at the policing in the United States today, probably should start with the premise: police exist to enforce. Right? Think of that phrase, law enforcement. What's in the middle of that word, enforcement? Force. They're going to use legalized force to force people comply with all the laws and regulations that the government has created. Sure. And then realize government has created far more laws and regulations than it is supposed to.
Right.
Far more than the Constitution provides, far more than they far exceeded the boundaries of justice and moral decency within a political community. So cops walk around with way too much power, way too many excuses. Every law, every regulation that gets passed is an excuse that a cop can use to harass, intimidate, threaten, bully a citizen. And that if you think of what they call when you an archer, they carry their arrows in a quiver.
Okay.
They put their arrows in a quiver. So if you think about a cop has this quiver full of arrows, there are more arrows. Every law, every regulation is an arrow. And they're more than ever before. And then we've added this other thing. Not only are cops walking around with more excuses than ever to harass citizens, we've shielded them in municipalities and states, and even woven into some federal legislation, like the legislation written by Joe Biden back in the 90s. We have shielded them in the form of qualified immunity, saying, right, Dave, if you hurt someone today, you go out and, hit someone with your car unintentionally, you just didn't see him, by golly, they can sue you. And right, you caused a lot of pain and suffering to that family because you hit somebody with a car. But if you're a cop and you do something like that and you cause damage and pain and suffering, you can't sue the cop because they're part of the government. And so when we think about policing, we have given them far more power than they actually ought to have. At the same time, we've shielded them from all kinds of the consequences of their own bad choices. And so I personally don't like to have a lot of cops around me because I usually think, man, somebody's going to find some excuse to, get in my face.
And you and I have talked a lot about this, and we're slightly on different planes with this, and this will be one of the few times in our podcast we are that way. But I almost want to frame it, and I want to talk about it in terms of what the progressives have done to cops since 1994. And you look at it a little bit as, well, now all these bad cops have all of these arrows in their quiver, right? And they have all of these opportunities to go out. If you're a bad cop, you have all these abilities to go out and harass people legally.
Well, let me clarify. No,
I
don't think the cops are bad. I think they're
people.
Well,
there are bad cops.
There are bad cops, but they're people. They're people, and they now have they're people who have incentives to do bad things.
Sure. Okay. So, and I look at it, let's go all the way back to that 94 crime bill. I think the progressives have passed so many laws and created so many rules and regulations through the bureaucracy that they have put the cops in a position where the cops are being expected to enforce a series of laws and regulations that even I think a lot of the cops think is wrong. Even a lot of the cops don't want to do this. And they have this internal battle of, well, I'm supposed to do my job, and this is how I make a living, and I take care of my family, and I want to be able to take care of my life. So I have to go do my job, but that seems wrong to me. It seems like a government overreach. And I'm not even talking about things that are like going and shooting up people, and I don't that happens very rarely. But there are a whole host of rules and regulations and laws that cops are being expected to enforce that I think most of them would say, I'd like to get those off the books because I don't like enforcing them. I don't like having to do that. And then
notice, let me just add an example here of, as some states have adopted these red flag laws in which people who have been convicted of no crime can have their weapons confiscated from them by law enforcement because a family member or friend or somebody reports something about them, something troubling about them. And many sheriffs, for example, in multiple states have said, we will not enforce this. I'm not going to go up to someone's house and use force to take their weapons away, someone who's been convicted of no crime.
Right.
That there's this idea here in the United States of due process of law, and we can't just go walk into someone's house and take their stuff.
Does Maxine Waters know that?
Probably not.
Apparently not. And apparently neither does Joe Biden, because Joe Biden also came out and said, I hope the jury comes out with the right verdict because the evidence is overwhelming.
Wow. What's one of the first premises of the criminal justice system in the context of a criminal trial? What's the whole purpose of having a criminal trial?
A fair and impartial jury.
Yeah, and the jury's there in the room, hears everything, sees everything in the trial, and then goes and deliberates. And the whole notion of an independent criminal justice system that features criminal trials for those accused of crimes, the whole premise is to get away from mob rule.
Right.
You think of I'm always reminded, part of this is fiction, part of it's quite real. Back during the witch trials up in Salem and surrounding communities, and there would be these mobs of people who were convinced some woman was a witch who was not a witch, but it didn't matter. They were so angry and filled with passion, and they'd march out with their burning torches and everything, and they actually murdered people who were accused of being witches. And the idea of our criminal justice system, the premise is we're not going to do that.
Right.
Just because they're a bunch of angry people, that doesn't mean they are the arbiters of justice. Because very often, mobs of angry people get all kinds of things wrong. They don't even know the basic facts.
I was just going to say that brings us back to our conversations about mob rule, and I want to have that conversation. I think it's really important to this. I want to finish what I was trying to, the position that I believe progressives have put cops in at this point. So on the one hand, I think they've asked cops to go out and enforce all of these laws that A, the cops don't want to, and B, I think a lot of people don't want them enforced, right? I think they're huge government overreaches. I think in a lot of cases, there are things that have been passed or regulated because of lobbyists saying, well, you got to protect my business. I'm this big corporation. You got to protect my business. Make that illegal. Make rules and laws against that.
Yeah.
And by doing so, if we make laws against it, then all of a sudden you have people doing little things here and there that cops would rather just say, all right, like It's happening. Then there's this whole other side of the coin, and this is what you were talking about, where there are progressives out saying, defund the police. The police are bad. The police are trying to hurt you. The police don't care about you. The police are racist. They're making blanket statements about these police forces. So you have cops who are being forced to go into these communities and enforce laws that really they shouldn't have to enforce in the first place. And they're now going into a community to do that in a place that the very people who are telling them to enforce that law are telling all of those residents, don't trust the people who are coming in to enforce it.
Right.
It's such a change from where we were long before you and I were on this earth. I don't know, 150 years ago. Right. Call it late 19th century, early 20th century. Where two things were happening. One, we had far fewer laws. The police were there to just do the proper purpose of government, and there wasn't a whole lot beyond that. And the cops were part of the community. The cops were walking into the community. They lived in those communities. They knew everybody in the community. They would go in. They would invest their time going in and getting to know all of the members of their community and having those relationships and knowing if they saw something or if they heard something, they would have a pretty good idea going into it. What's going on over there and what do I need to be prepared for? And it lowers the risk factor within that situation.
To your point, and I don't want to emphasize this too much because the correlation is not perfect, but there's certainly something to it. There have basically been, throughout American history, two models of policing: the elected county sheriff model and the professional municipal police department. And what has happened in the course of American history, early years, there was very little in terms of municipal professional police department where you have a police chief who is hired, not elected.
Right.
He's not in fact, very often he's hired from someplace far away because he's an expert. He has certain degrees and certain accomplishments and certifications. There was very little of that in early American history. Most policing was done by elected county sheriffs. I mean, this is a goofy TV example, but the old, in Mayberry,
Andy Griffith?
Andy Griffith, right? Kind of a corny, black and white TV show about this. But the point, he was the elected sheriff.
And everybody knew him.
Everybody knew. They elected him. And if he was to abuse his powers, everybody knew exactly what to do about it. In the next election, you boot him out and you hire someone else in.
And the election aspect of that is really, really important because if you're going to get elected, what do you have to do? You have to go into those communities and convince people to vote for you.
You got to get to know them.
Right. You got to make them trust you and everything else.
It's kind of funny here because within policing over the last 3 decades, there's been this big movement towards community policing, trying to get citizens and cops, talking to each other and working together. Well, there's a great model of community policing. It's called the elected county sheriff, right?
Right.
And the sheriff's deputies. And what has happened over time is certainly in metropolitan areas, the progressive model of professional police departments has really eclipsed the county sheriff. In many metro areas, a place like Denver, Colorado, or Los Angeles, California, the county sheriff will run the jails and do some administrative functions, but the real policing is actually done by the municipal, professional police force.
And there's one last thing that causes, and I have a lot of friends who have been police, and they all have echoed this. The sentiment, first of all, the fact that they could walk into basically any situation, we have gotten to a point where we're so overregulated that a policeman could walk into almost any circumstance, anything, and find something they could arrest somebody for or fine somebody for.
Sure.
I mean, it is almost impossible to say this wasn't built right. Your house, this is the wrong type of screw, and therefore I'm going to give you a fine. I mean, little things even to that point. So these police officers, one, are facing this thing of if they do walk into somebody's house, if they do try to go meet the neighbors are afraid to let them in because they know there's going to be something in their house that they can get in trouble for. It is almost impossible to
even if they don't know what it is.
Right. it has become almost impossible to follow every single law
Yes.
strictly.
Yes.
The second part about it is because the progressive movement has made cops such villains in those communities, they don't feel safe walking into those communities and saying, "Hey, I'm so and so. I'd love to meet you. I just want to get to know my neighbors. I want to get to know
Right.
people in the community." And it's become so difficult at this point for them to even get to a point where they can have those relationships that would bring down this level of violence so substantially.
I want to weave in a personal story. Now this is dated and things have changed. This goes back to the mid '90s. I moved from rural Kansas to Los Angeles, California, having never been in California. That's where I went to graduate school out there. And I know people watching this are going to laugh when I admit this. Many people don't know this about me. My background when I was younger, I was heavily involved in the world of powerlifting and weightlifting. I used to compete in that stuff. And so I got out to California. First thing I did is went and found a real kind of, jarhead sort of gym where guys were serious about working out. And it was there was an old rickety fan in the corner, no air conditioning, and it was just a bunch of iron and benches and bars and things like that. Well, I got to know a guy in there, and we became very good friends, and he was on the LA County Sheriff's Department. And there I was in graduate school. I'm studying political science. And we started hanging out, and he's interested in what I'm studying. I'm interested in what he does. And he started inviting me to come on ride-alongs. Mm-hmm. And so I was doing ride-alongs in the LA County Sheriff's Office. And I would they had these green windbreakers that said in big yellow letters, sheriff on the back. And here's one of the things I learned. The LAPD, which is a very progressive organization, professional police department, when an LAPD officers would pull up to gang members, those gangs in Los Angeles, they viewed the LAPD as a rival gang. Period. They would attack them, shoot at them, run. That was a rival gang. That meant war. When the LA County sheriffs would pull up, they would talk to them. It was the most fascinating thing in there. Now, to be clear, they weren't all buddies and chums, but they were on talking terms. They could have a conversation.
Yeah.
And those gang members didn't see the sheriff's deputies as their mortal enemy that they had to kill right there on the spot. I wanted to add one more point, going back to what you were just saying about all these laws that progressives have created. They're not only voluminous, they are often contradictory.
Yes.
So we've put law enforcement in a real jam, a real pickle, because they often have to enforce multiple sets of laws that are incompatible with each other. One of the things I've done in my career is I've done training for police units, mainly sheriff's offices. And one time I did training here in Colorado. There's a Colorado Sheriff's Association, so all 60, I think there's 64 counties, but 2 counties don't have, Broomfield doesn't have a sheriff. I think there are 62 county sheriffs. Anyway, I had them all in a room, and I did some training. And these tend to be crusty old law guys, right? That's how you become an elected sheriff.
Yeah.
And we were having a good time. And then things got serious. And I laid out a scenario in front of them. I said, suppose here in Colorado, the people of Colorado, whether wisely or unwisely, I'll let others make, I'm not making a judgment here. I'm just pointing out the fact that Colorado legalized marijuana. Mm-hmm. The federal government has unconstitutionally, by the way, there's no constitutional authority for this, but nonetheless, Congress passed a detailed federal drug code, a criminal code, and marijuana is illegal according to federal law. So in a place like Colorado today, it is legal to have marijuana under state law. It is a felony crime under federal law.
Right.
2 laws that contradict each other. And I created this scenario for these sheriffs. I said, what if your best friend who lives near you, who helped you get elected, really, campaigned a lot, gave you money, told all of his friends to vote for you, because you two have been friends for a long time. And he calls you and says, Sheriff, get over here. The DEA or the FBI, they're tearing my house apart. And I have not broken any Colorado law. Now, the sheriff takes an oath to uphold the laws and Constitution of Colorado, as well as the United States Constitution and all laws pursuant to the United States Constitution. And I said, what would you do? You go over to your friend's house. Would you arrest those DEA agents or FBI agents? Do you think a DEA agent would let you arrest him? Or would the DEA agent push back if a county sheriff attempted to arrest him? If the DEA agent pushed back, how much would he push back? Would he bring the full power of the federal government down on this local county sheriff's office? I was asking those kinds of questions, and that room got dead silent.
Yeah.
Because all those sheriffs, they do realize there's a problem here. We have laws in the United States now. In this case, it's because the federal government has violated the Constitution and passed the kinds of laws like drug laws they're not supposed to pass. That is supposed to be done at the state and local level. And so law enforcement now not only has to uphold and enforce many laws, it has to uphold and enforce contradictory laws, which makes their life really difficult. And there have been some high-profile cases where involving, I think it was the Bureau of Land Management out on a certain, rancher's land, federal BLM agents are not Black Lives Matter, Bureau of Land Management agents are out there. And then the county sheriff comes along and says, get off this property. And there have been, showdowns between county sheriffs and federal agents.
Thinking of the show Yellowstone. As you're talking about this.
Yeah.
You're right. And that whole contradiction, it just goes back to we have Article 1, Sections 8, 9, and 10 for a reason. The Constitution was designed the way it was for a reason. And all of this government overreach, I think, has put cops in a really, really awkward situation. And a situation that really they can't be successful in.
I don't ask you this often live during a podcast. I'm going to ask you for a prediction. What do you predict is going to happen to police departments moving forward? What young person, what young man or young woman today in their 20s, thinking about getting their career started, what young American would want to become a law enforcement officer today?
They're not. We're already seeing statistically the number of people enrolling in the academies is dropping exponentially. My two closest friends who are lifelong officers, not my two closest friends are lifelong officers. My two closest friends who are lifelong officers. One has already left the force, and one is not sure what to do. I mean, when he became a cop, he felt like this was his calling. It was in his wedding. I mean, we talk about this all the time. And I remember the day he decided to become a cop. And he was a bouncer in bars when he was in college and all that kind of stuff. But he's
a natural keeper of the peace.
He is. And he's huge. He's about 6'4", 6'5", nearly 300 pounds and mostly muscle.
Yeah.
And he's not the kind of guy you want to mess with in a bar.
Right.
But when you think about him, I remember the day he told me he decided to become a cop. And it was like all of a sudden this weight of what am I supposed to do with my life had disappeared because he finally found something that he loved doing. What's funny, he's a registered libertarian. He does not like big central government. He does not. He'll be one of the first to tell you he has to enforce laws all the time that he thinks I'm doing this because it's my job and I want to keep my job, but this isn't right. I shouldn't be doing this. I think he would be the first to walk away if somebody said, okay, go shoot that person.
Yep.
Right? I mean, he will say no at one point, but this has become a really difficult place for him. He's really not sure what to do with himself.
Well, and there's another big piece of this whole subject we haven't really talked about, and we should add this in because it goes right to the core precepts and virtues around which the Vino Veritas Society revolves. We talk about the 4 basic core civic virtues of citizenship. And the very first one is self-restraint.
Right.
Free people, if they're going to live freely among other free citizens, under the law, they need to be self-governing, self-controlled, self-restrained. When citizens exercise self-restraint and they don't give in to their passions and their appetites and their anger and their tempers, and even though they might feel like hurting someone or assaulting someone or stealing from someone, they don't. They resist those temptations.
They're respectful of other people's persons and property.
When citizens do that, there's not much need for law enforcement.
Right.
Which is a good thing in general. In general, I think we should probably all should agree we want to live in a world where there's not much demand for the services of law enforcement because there's not a lot of injustices going on.
Now, let's add to that, though. That's in a scenario where we don't have a huge progressive bureaucratic state creating all of these laws as well.
Yes.
Right? We could all have all the self-restraint in the world, but if the government wants to tell us how every aspect of our life has to be run, like the reference I used earlier, you have to use these screws when building a deck on your house. If the screw you use is 3 1/4 inch long and you use one that's 3 inches long, all of a sudden you've broken a law.
There's an old line that's been used by a number of different authors. Make enough laws and eventually everybody becomes a criminal. Everybody, because you don't even know when you're breaking the laws if the laws become so voluminous. So you're absolutely right. And so, when citizens are not virtuous, when they're not respectful of the rights of the people around them, that's when the angry man makes a fist and punches his wife or girlfriend, and then the wife or the girlfriend picks up the phone and calls 911, and now there are cops coming into someone's house. And there needs to be something. There's injustice happening. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying the less virtuous citizens are, the more that they're relying on the police, and they're relying on the police for things that really the police aren't very good. Police aren't good at helping people have good marriages and good relationships, right? That's not their job. That's not what they do. And yet they spend a whole lot of time answering calls of domestic disturbances, domestic violence, and things like that, all of which really emanate from people not exercising self-restraint, not being very virtuous.
And I'm going to make this personal for a minute. All of that you just said and everything we've been talking about has led there to be a lack of police available, and a decision to, if somebody's life or physical well-being isn't in jeopardy, for the most part in big cities, the police have just said, sorry, there's nothing we're gonna do about it.
Right.
Last week, about a week and a half ago, I was robbed. Somebody broke into my garage. Yep. I had something very, very important to me. Somebody came in with bolt cutters. It was a motorized vehicle. They came in with bolt cutters. They cut off the locks, and they walked out the door with it while I was at a chapter meeting for the Vino Veritas Society.
Right.
And I called the police as soon as I got home. I said, I need an officer to come over. I need to file a report, and I need to figure out how we're going to find this thing. It is irreplaceable. It's
a one of a kind.
It is a one of a kind. Nothing like it exists in the world anymore today.
Right.
And they said, sorry, we don't have the bandwidth to do it. I mean, that wasn't their exact words, but here's the link online to go fill out a report, and we'll put it into the national database that searches the internet for somebody trying to sell it. And beyond that, there's nothing we can do. I had to go beg surrounding businesses to see their security cameras. I didn't find anything, but there was just no interest at all by the police to even try to find it.
Right.
And this wasn't, I'm certain of it, this wasn't it's just somebody who's homeless who thought, I could sell this and get a meal for it. This was planned. Somebody had heavy-duty bolt cutters. They had to break through 2 doors of the garage, everything else. And we've gotten to a point where that's proper purpose of government, going out and helping deal with theft.
Yeah, recover stolen property.
And they said, there's no way.
So contrast, again, this is an exercise of the imagination. Look at our world today, more laws and regulations than anyone can count or read or know, and a total breakdown in civic virtue, people not respecting each other's rights, not being self-restrained or self-assertive, having no civic knowledge. They're not self-reliant. They're very dependent. And contrast that with a world, imagine a world where there were very few laws, where citizens were mostly virtuous, not angels, but mostly, in large measures, they were respecting the rights of the people around them. In that kind of world, when an injustice happened, it was big news.
Yep.
It really stood out, no matter what the injustice was. And everybody, including the local law enforcement, would want to solve that crime best that they could.
That's such an important point, right? It wasn't just the local law enforcement. It was the whole community said, I can't believe that just happened in our community.
Because it was rare.
And we're going to figure out who did it because we don't want that person acting that way. We don't want somebody in our community who's doing that.
And we don't want that kind of behavior to become the norm. We don't want other people out there thinking about engaging in crime or violating rights to start thinking, you can get away with it. We want to show everybody, you steal or assault or rape or murder, bad things are going to happen.
Right.
We're not going to stand for that.
Right. So you brought up earlier, and I pulled us back to that dichotomy I was talking about earlier, but you brought up qualified immunity earlier. And I think it's something we at the Vino Veritas Society talked about early on when we had just a handful of members.
Right.
I think it's worth taking our last 10 minutes or so to talk that through a little bit.
Sure.
You mentioned it a little bit, right? It's this idea. It was originally started, I think the intent, right? Like a lot of laws, the intent of qualified immunity was initially good. The intent was if a criminal was running from a cop who was chasing him following a crime, as an example, and that criminal tripped on the sidewalk and broke bones in his face, right, when he was running away, the cop can't be held liable for that, which I think we would generally recognize. If you would hope that if that went to court, a normal group of 12 jurors would sit there and say, we're not going to hold the cop responsible for you being stupid. I'm trying to remember the exact line from Shawshank Redemption. But there was a scene in there. They were they go around the table, all the criminals go around the table and talk about what they did.
Well, the convicts.
Turns
out the main character in that movie isn't a criminal.
Sure.
He is a convict. He was convicted,
Sure.
but he didn't actually commit a crime.
If I'm remembering that this was the right movie, and I might be mixing up movies, but there's a story about one of them who he was stealing a television.
Yes.
And this is way back, right?
Yes.
So these are huge tube televisions, everything else. And he's stealing a television. And he is running away, and the cop says, "Put your hands up," and he goes like this, and the television drops on the cop's foot and breaks the cop's foot. We're not talking about necessarily that, but like that's kind of the intent of qualified immunity. If he had dropped it on his own foot, he probably would have sued the cop today and said, "You made me put my hands up, and I dropped a TV on my foot, and it broke my foot, and I want you to pay my medical bills." It has expanded drastically. The use of qualified immunity has been used to get a lot of cops out of situations of things that they should not have done or should have been held.
Them, protect them from the consequences of their own bad choices.
Right. And Derek Chauvin, I said this earlier. He's not a good cop. The guy had been in trouble repeatedly for excessive violence and all of these types of things, and qualified immunity had protected him throughout that entire thing. Interestingly, there are a lot of cases, of known cases, and I'm not familiar enough with court records of California, but that when Kamala Harris was the Attorney General of California, she protected a lot of cops using qualified immunity. So this is not necessarily like a partisan thing. I like to say to people, I'm not looking to just get rid of qualified immunity. I'm looking to replace it with a better situation, with a better solution. And I've always made the argument that there are free market solutions out there.
Sure.
I would have no problem as a taxpayer paying for, as part of a cop's salary, right? Taxpayers pay for the police, and I think they should. As part of that salary, they get insurance. They get an insurance policy through tax dollars, through part of their compensation. But that insurance company, it at one point is going to say, this cop has become too much of a liability. It's a free market solution. At one point, they're going to say, you're going to have to pay this much more for this cop to keep being insured. And we have a line that says,
here's where I think I agree with you in part and differ in part. I agree with you. I like the idea of insurance. I have insurance on my car. And if I frequently keep smashing into things and getting DUIs and getting big tickets and all these things that make me very high risk, and I'm costing the insurance money a lot because I keep crashing my car into things. At some point, the insurance company is going to keep charging me more and more and more until possibly I can't afford the insurance. Or they might just say, we're not going to offer you insurance at all. You're
And
just too risky.
Almost always get to that point.
Right.
It is very rare that they will just keep charging you more and more and more.
Right.
They get to a point, and medical insurance too.
So where I would differ is, as long as the taxpayers are on the hook, they'll keep paying all those increased prices and premiums. I would say make the police carry their own insurance. Make them pay for it. And then if they become higher risk, if they violate the rights of others and they become and they're getting sued because they've caused damages and their liability insurance goes up, they got to pay for that.
Well, I mean, this is a bigger conversation, I think, than we're going to have in the next 5 minutes. My big position on that is I don't think we pay cops enough. It's one of those things that I think if it was a free market solution, it's one of those things that we would probably – a cop who was doing his job well would be getting a lot higher. I kind of classify them in the same position as teachers. I think unions and making them public employees has severely diminished the value that they're compensated. I also think that, I look at how doctors handle things because of their malpractice insurance, how lawyers handle things because of their malpractice insurance. And those are dangerous. Those can really affect the way that they do their job on a daily basis. They will refuse to go in to take on certain clients, right? Doctors, we hear all the time, I'm not touching that. It's going to make my insurance go up. I know you. And I don't want cops to say, I don't want to go into that neighborhood because I know what it's going to end up doing to my malpractice. It's essentially malpractice insurance.
Right.
The other thing is, and the only other argument I'd make is, when you do that, when you're a doctor, usually your company will pay for your insurance, and you'll get fired if that gets too high.
Right.
And we have to figure out, but there is I think the point is there is a free market solution there that allows
versus blanket qualified immunity.
Right. That says you can't get in trouble for anything you do, and we're going to use this to get you out of trouble. And I was listening to a conversation recently among some military people. They're having the same conversations, right? There's bad seeds in the military too who are creating reputations and causing problems that they don't want to deal with either. And this idea of self-policing or things like that within communities and within departments, when you get to that free market solution, can really help get us into a better place.
Yep. So these are big. These are structural problems and possible structural solutions we're talking about. It means in a particular case like Derek Chauvin, no matter how the jury comes out, citizens going and not being virtuous, citizens who go out and decide to loot and burn and destroy private property owned by their fellow citizens is not going to solve these kinds of structural problems that we're talking about.
And the people who own those businesses, the police aren't going to be able to be everywhere.
Right.
And in this country, they have a right to defend themselves and their property, their persons and property. And to try to take away that ability and just say, you know what, just let your store burn. Right. Just let them loot it. Just let them steal it. The other night in Minnesota, they burned down an Apple store. Right. Which is it's not even it doesn't even make sense. There comes a point where people have to be able to defend themselves because that's a lot of people's livelihood. We like to look at the big companies in this world. We like to look at the Walmarts and the Amazons and the Apples. That's not the majority of the businesses in this country. The majority of them are small businesses where people are, if they can't be open tomorrow, we learned that during the pandemic. If they can't be open tomorrow, they're in trouble.
When it comes to government, we need to remember our key 6 precepts, one of which is the proper purpose of government. When it comes to fellow citizens, we need to keep in mind the 4 civic virtues that we talk about at the Vino Veritas Society: self-restraint, self-assertion, civic knowledge, self-reliance. Those are the keys to making real progress, to transforming America into a beacon of freedom, to all of us being freer and flourishing, And that's not going to happen unless we have the guardians, people who actually guard those precepts, those virtues, that guard the American idea.
And to keep pushing back on the progressive state that just keeps expanding and expanding and creates more of these problems than it fixes.
That's why we're the guardians.
Nos sumus custodes.